Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Puberty, Sexuality, and Relationships, the Road to Adulthood for Adolescents with ASD. My name is Emily Smith and I work with Sexuality. If you're not familiar with us, Sexuality is a leading provider of special ed management systems. We are committed to supporting school districts and special ed staff in fulfilling the promises made by IDEA to students with disabilities. Our systems streamline every step of the special ed process, including IEP development, service tracking, and Medicaid billing. And of course, you can find out more about our systems by visiting our website, excelify.com. So before we get started, I would like to take a minute to explain a couple of technical things about the webinar. So during the webinar, you'll be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you do have questions, please type them into the chat box in your control panel, and I'll do my best to answer questions throughout by chatting back to you, and then field as many questions as we have time for to Dr. Dotson, our host, at the end of the session. A recording of this webinar and the webinar slides will be made available to those who complete a short survey following the webinar, so please stay on the line. And last but not least, if you are on social media, so are we. You can follow us on social to find out about future webinars, events, news, and contests, and you can tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag SpedChatWeb. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Wesley Dotson. Dr. Dotson is the Interim Co-Director and the Director of Outpatient Services for the Burkhart Center for Autism Education and Research, as well as an Assistant Professor in the Special Education Program at Texas Tech University. He earned his Master's in Applied Behavioral Science in 2007 and his PhD in Behavioral Psychology in 2010 from the University of Kansas. He has spent over 15 years in special ed, working with individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities of all ages. He has worked as a high school special ed teacher, a behavioral consultant, and an in-home therapist for individuals with severe disabilities before moving into higher education. His primary areas of research are social skills, relationship development, and successful life outcomes for adolescents and young adults with autism, as well as the preparation of teachers and other professionals to work successfully with students with autism. So, Dr. Dotson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emily. It's an honor to be here, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm excited to get the opportunity to talk about a topic that I think too often we put our fingers in our ears and go la 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 la, and really hope it just kind of goes away or takes care of itself. When for everything else we do with our folks on the spectrum, we know that's not often the case. So I've got a few goals today for what I hope to accomplish. One is I just want to talk a little bit about the changes associated with puberty, especially the environmental and physiological changes, and what kind of effect that can have on individuals with autism spectrum disorders. I want to talk about some of the common challenges faced during this time, both by the individuals on the spectrum and by those who are working with them. I'm going to give you some very specific tips and ideas to help you overcome those challenges, and I hope realize that if you can teach a child with autism to tie his shoes, you can teach a teenager with autism how to ask for a date. Good teaching is good teaching. And then finally, I'm going to provide some recommendations for what it means to build a quality and full life, not just sexuality, not just how to survive puberty, but how to take the opportunity of puberty and that developing awareness of identity to help people develop a sense of their own agency and a sense of their own identity so that they can have a full and complete life as they move into adulthood. So that's what we're here for. And as Emily said, please be typing questions into the chat. My goal is to leave enough time at the end to be able to answer a few. You'll also see that I'm going to give you some very specific resources that you can take with you from this webinar that I hope will make it a little less intimidating and feel a little more hopeful if you have to deal with these challenges. So I want to start with just some opening ideas. First, I work from the basic premise that I believe is supported by the literature that adult independence and happiness is built on the ability to establish and maintain relationships. that positive, reciprocal relationships lay the foundation for nearly every life outcome that we consider to be important, whether it be interpersonal relationships, employment, intimacy, that relationships are what being an adult is about. But we have to remember that not all relationships and friendships are the same. I think way too often we as practitioners and parents want our children and our students to have exactly the kinds of relationships that we have. And we too often think that friendships in the style that we have them are the only kind of friendships. But I can tell you, even before I started doing this for a living, I realized just how varied it is what a relationship looks like. Romantic relationships take many forms. Friendships take many forms. People have different levels of social and sexual need. And so the way that they meet those needs are different. For example, some people have one or two close friends and count themselves socially content. Other people aren't happy unless they've got 20 or 30 people whom they consider acquaintances. My sister and I are a wonderful example of that. My three best friends I've known for 20 years. I've added exactly one person to that list in the last 10 years that I consider to be a truly great friend. I'm content with that. I'm content going out socially one, maybe 2 nights a week. My sister, on the other hand, has what feels like 30 best friends. And she's not happy if she's not meeting those friends, going to lunch, going to coffee, having them over for dinner, going out to eat 5 or even 6 nights of the week. Neither of those is right. Neither of those is wrong. We have different levels of need for social interaction. And if you were to look at our friendships and the way that our friendships work, and you tried to force either of us to use the other's model, we'd both be pretty unhappy. So as we go through all this, just remember that different people value different levels and types of relationships. Not everybody wants a monogamous sexual relationship that ends in marriage and children. Not everybody wants to date a lot of people. Some people want dating to be social. Some people want dating to be sexual. Some people don't want to date at all, but they're still interested in learning about sex. And the only way you learn those things about yourself and your values is through experience and introspection and the opportunity and knowledge to know how different things look. So when we talk about our priorities with folks on the spectrum, it's understanding that we did not discover our preferences without our own attempts and failures. So, what do I think that means practically? Well, some things to keep in mind. Puberty's hard. Nobody wants to go back and be 12 to 15 again. Puberty is confusing. Your body's changing. It doesn't make sense. Nobody that goes through puberty sails through thinking it was a breeze and wonderful and easy. It's hard. And that's important to remember. They're 13. We were all awkward at 13. Our bodies were changing. Hair was growing places it shouldn't. We were all uncomfortable in our own skin and trying to figure out what it meant to have skin and be in skin and touch other people's skin, or not, or should I, or what's that mean? And so when we're faced with challenges, when we talk about what are the issues we have to address in autism, we need to remember that our first question should be, is this something to do with autism, or is this just puberty? Is it just the hormones? But the other thing to say is that while it's hard, and it's not going to be easy because puberty is hard, and sometimes it's the hormones, good teaching is still good teaching. Okay? If you can teach eating, self-care, math, reading, you can teach the skills they need to survive puberty and to have healthy adult intimate relationships. You've got to learn to be comfortable with some words that you may otherwise not be comfortable with. You may have to develop a poker face on the outside and inside be squirming, but good teaching is good teaching. The same skills that we use to teach them academic behaviors can teach them social behaviors and sexual behaviors and adult behaviors versus child behaviors. But here's an important part of what I always say when we talk about puberty and sexuality and adulthood. Failure is a part of this. I know as a behavior analyst I'm supposed to talk about only positive reinforcement and errorless learning is wonderful, but when we're talking about dating, I wish I could see your hands when I give this talk in person. Raise your hand if you're married to the very first person you ever went on a date with. I know my hand's not going to be up. Heck, raise your hand if you're married to the first person you kissed, or the first person who you held hands with, or the first person you asked for a date. Failure is a part of adult relationships, and failed relationships are the norm, not the exception. Think about the number of people who you count to be good friends. And then think about the number of people who have been your good friends for your entire life. I said my best friends I've had for 20 years, and I have. That's 3 people. I was probably friends with 100 or 200 people in those 20 years, good enough to go out with them, have them over to my house, be over to their house, meet their families. The reality is, most relationships do not last forever. We all fail at maintaining our friendships and our intimate relationships much more often than we succeed, and we need to remember that that's part of how we learn. I didn't learn the type of woman I shouldn't date until I dated the wrong type of woman a few times, or maybe more than a few times. I'll pretend I'm still learning that lesson, because I am. Failure helps us learn, and being resilient in the face of that failure is an important life skill. I think too often with our folks on the spectrum, we want to protect them. And when it comes to adult relationships, we need to be careful, because the opportunity to learn from our failures is often how we learn how to be a better friend, a better boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, confidant, support, relative, whatever it may be. And what I will absolutely tell you when dealing with teenagers and young adults, it's not always going to work. I guarantee it's not always going to be pretty. There will be lots of mistakes. There will be lots of blushing. There will be awkward laughs. You're going to say penis, or they're going to say penis, and everyone's going to go, But it's important. And it's work that absolutely must be done if we are going to prepare people on the spectrum to live full and adult lives. It must be done. So let's talk some context. Let's talk about what the literature says about puberty, about sexuality, about adolescence, social skills, relationships, and ultimately the sorts of positive life outcomes I'm assuming you want to achieve for the people you work with because you're on this webinar. Well, the literature is surprisingly clear. When we talk about the biggest predictors of rating yourself having a high quality of life, having a healthy sexuality and concept of sexual identity, being employed, earning a higher wage, working more hours in a week, living independently, and having friends, every one of those is closely tied to and predicted by the ability of the individual to develop and maintain relationships. We know that as people grow older, there's much less of a support system around them. You don't have classmates once you're out of school. You don't have teachers or counselors or school psychologists. You've got to be able to develop a support system on your own, and with that, to do that, you must have the ability to develop and maintain relationships. But what we know also from the literature is that few children and adolescents with disabilities, including autism, develop friendships with same-age peers. There was a post-secondary outcomes study done by the Federal Disabilities Office and published about 4 years ago now that showed by self-report of thousands of people with disabilities that 75% or more of their social interactions were with family members and paid caregivers. So of these thousands of people with disabilities they talked to, those people reported that 75% or more of their social interactions were with parents and paid caregivers. Think about that in relation to your own life. Think about your own ratio. What's your ratio of social interactions between friends, co-workers, children, family members, and paid caregivers? What that means in a concrete sense is that many of these young adults with autism and other disabilities never even have the chance to practice their skills at friendships and relationships. They're not even being exposed to or having an opportunity to interact much with folks who are not family and paid caregivers. And we also know that the single biggest predictor of the ability to develop positive relationships is the level of social skills of the person trying to build the relationships. In other words, if I had to pick one thing to do that would have the biggest impact on the quality of life of an individual on the spectrum moving into adulthood, it would be to focus on the development of age-appropriate and complex social skills. Because those social skills directly predict the ability to build and maintain relationships, which then predict a higher quality of life, a more healthy sense of individual and sexual identity, a higher likelihood of competitive employment at a higher wage with more hours, and more independent living relative to not having those relationships. So that's why, even though this is a talk about puberty and sexuality, when we talk about quality of life and outcomes, this is all ultimately about social skills and the ability to develop and build relationships. So that's the literature about the importance of relationships and why they matter and why social skills matter. Well, what's the literature say about puberty and disability? Well, not surprisingly, guess what? People on the spectrum are human. So they're going to experience puberty and develop sexual urges and interest just like their peers. Whether they're verbal or nonverbal, have a motor issue or not, they are going to experience puberty and start to feel the tingles and the wallops and get the erections and have the physiological responses that every one of their peers will. With the same diversity, by the way, of their peers. Because there is no one puberty any more than there's one sexuality. So, disability or no, autism or no, going through puberty is going through puberty. But what it also means is that as they hit puberty, just like their peers, there is a great interest in and increased seeking of peer friendships. Any of you who have parented or worked with teenagers know somewhere around 12 to 14, adults are no longer cool. We know absolutely nothing. And that cute cheerleader in the front row or the cool guy on the back row, king of the world, Einstein incarnate. In other words, when they hit puberty, their social reinforcers tend to change and to move toward peers being more reinforcing than family and adults. We also know that the overwhelming majority of people on the spectrum express the same desire for intimate relationships as everybody else. I think it's one of the most pernicious and harmful myths about autism spectrum disorders that they are antisocial or asexual. That's not been my experience. It's not the experience of the literature. It's not the experience of the adults we work with. The overwhelming majority want the same types of intimacy that the rest of us do. They want to date. They want to be married. They want to have a family in whatever form is most appropriate and interesting to them, most fulfilling to them. But they want intimate relationships. Their social skills may make that difficult. The core deficits of autism spectrum disorder certainly make it more challenging, but just because it's hard and challenging doesn't mean they don't want it or they're not reinforced by it. It's why I don't like Sheldon Cooper as a character. He's a great case study in autism symptomology, but I absolutely despise the fact that he's essentially asexual. Everyone loves the Big Bang Theory. Oh, that's people with autism. Yes and no. Most that I've worked with would tell you they're very interested in the dating and the marriage and the family, and they don't need to be railroaded into trying to be interested as a TV trope. Now, here's the ugly reality of puberty with people on the spectrum. The consequences for inappropriate behaviors as you move into adolescence and young adulthood, especially inappropriate behaviors related to sexuality or to physical and physiological development, are much more severe in adolescence and adulthood. A tantruming 6-year-old is cute. A tantruming 16-year-old is terrifying. A tantruming 26-year-old will be in jail. So as people with autism move into puberty, we have to remember that the urgency of dealing with some of these behaviors is great for no other reason than the consequences become much more severe. It's the combination of that increased desire for friends and poor social skills that puts them at increased risk for bullying and exploitation in both directions. Folks on the spectrum are among the most at-risk population for sexual harassment, for sexual abuse, but they're also more likely to engage in the behavior the other way because they want the intimacy, they don't have great skills, they may not distinguish social or nonverbal cues, and so they're more likely to stalk. They're more likely to make inappropriate physical contact. They're more likely to harass and not even realize they're doing it. And when you do those things at 18, 19, 20 years old when you're in college, it can be crippling. You can end up with a criminal record. We have one of our college students right now who's about to become a sex offender for a failure to discriminate a social cue. Was it malicious? No. Was he trying to harass? No. But in a literal sense, did he harass? Absolutely. And he will suffer consequences for it. And it's unfortunate, but it's very real. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's to set the context for what it means to go through puberty on the spectrum. And I want to talk a little bit now about some of the complexities. I've talked about some of the challenges. Now I want to hopefully give you some nuance on things to think about when you talk about social skills and knowledge for adolescents and young adults. They get more complicated. So conversational skills change. It's one thing to recognize manners and what it means to have good etiquette at a dinner party versus a black tie affair versus a college party. And then it's also recognizing that a conversation at a function like that, this chit-chat, is different than maybe having that uncomfortable conversation with a friend because you feel like they're taking advantage of you. So conversational skills, already complex, become more so. And there's a need to discriminate different types of conversations. There's identification and initiation of social opportunities that fit that person. So you've got to think about how will they recognize what it means to create and take advantage of social opportunities where they are at as an adult. I'm sure we all know and have experienced that it's different making friends at 25 than it was in college or in high school. The one that we see come up a whole lot with our college students is how do you discriminate the type of conversation you have with your friends versus someone who you'd like to be more than friends? That's a difficult thing to navigate for nearly anybody. For someone on the spectrum trying to figure out how to use conversational and especially nonverbal cues to signal a different kind of interest than friendship is one of the most terrifying and difficult things we might help them achieve. And then, of course, related to my earlier stuff, you've got to be aware of boundaries and appropriate sexual behavior. I'll talk about that explicitly later, but people with autism need it made concrete and clear when we talk about what it means to have an appropriate adult relationship. Boundaries and appropriate behavior, especially around sexual behavior, are a huge part of it. Now, I hope I haven't scared you too badly, but there is good news. And the good news is you already know how to do more of this than you think you do. We have a lot of evidence-based practices that help us know how to work with students on the spectrum. The same visual supports that you use to create the picture schedules and communication systems work to teach sexuality and puberty and masturbation and menstruation as they do to teach math and reading and shoe tying. Video modeling can teach dating skills just like it can teach lunchroom skills. It can teach appropriate sexual hygiene in the same way that it can teach appropriate hair washing or face washing. Script fading can help develop a repertoire of complex social skills related to dating in the same way that can help kids learn to have a recess conversation in elementary school. And peer-mediated strategies certainly come into their own when we're talking about helping our folks with autism find mentors and people to help them navigate a more complex and daunting adult world. And straight up teaching, by the way. We sometimes forget the value of simply having a lesson. Sitting down, identifying a skill, breaking it into parts, talking about when to use it, modeling it, having them practice, and sending them out to try it. And then finally, social stories. All of these things are evidence-based. All of these things have successfully taught people with autism different skills, and all of them have successfully taught skills related to puberty and sexuality and what it means to have a quality adult life. So if you know how to do these things, you know how to teach these topics. You may still blush at the word vagina, but you can teach what it is and what the parts of it are and what to do with it just as well using these techniques as you can teach 2-digit addition or a 3-digit division. Now, some things to keep in mind. I've got an hour, and actually 45 minutes if I want to leave questions. So this is going to be an overview, but again, I'll give you resources at the end. So I want to take the talk to give you some things to think about. When we talk about using those procedures to teach, make sure that as you're teaching these skills, you're always doing it with the context of thinking about how can I get this person more involved in their community? How can I get them more in touch with a network that will survive and sustain with them after school. So how do I get them plugged into their community? Also, and this is a mistake that I absolutely see all the time, you need to be working and building skills to build relationships where they are most likely to form for that person. We have both a transition academy here and a college support program at the Burkhart Center. And at any one time, we might have 40 or 45 young adults on the spectrum in our transition programs. And I would conservatively say that 30 to 35 of those 40 at a time come to us in their first year. They don't even know what they like to do on the weekends because their hobbies are what their parents do. Their social activities are what their brothers or sisters took them to do. And when they get to college or they come to us to learn how to live independently or more independently, when we say, what do you like to do on a Friday night? Oh, my brother always takes me bowling. And we say, right, but what do you do? Oh, I don't know. Well, we try to address that. When you're looking at someone and saying, how do I build a quality life for you? One of the most important questions you can ask is what kind of life do they want? And where do they want their relationships to be? It comes down to agency. And that's a word I heard used last weekend by a young man on the spectrum who's an amazing self-advocate, Paul Loudon. And he talked about the difference between independence and agency. And he said independence means, you're living on your own and you can, take care of yourself and pay your bills. But agency means you have the ability to make your decisions and take responsibility for them. And isn't that what we all want? So as we work with these adolescents and these young adults and we talk about what is your sexual identity, what is sexual health, what does it mean to have friends, what do you want your intimate relationships to look like, those are the questions we should be asking. We shouldn't be dictating those things. We should be helping them to discover for themselves, who do they want to be? What's the outcome they want? They may not want kids. They may not want to be married. They may desperately want children and to be married. They may only want a few friends. They may want someone to dance with and not someone to watch movies with. My question to you is, before you start intervening, do you know what their preferences are? So what do we know about these relationships and social skills then? I want to give you some thoughts on that as well. People with autism need explicit instruction on how to build and maintain relationships. And they are built on reciprocity. In other words, healthy adult relationships are about creating a regular and voluntary exchange between people. One of the key reasons that adult relationships come to an end is that they're no longer reinforcing to both people. We all know that person who only wants to talk on the phone about themselves. And if you think about how often you get on the phone with them, it's probably less and less. But it's also important to realize, just as in every other facet of working with people on the spectrum, you don't get to choose their reinforcers for them. And so when we talk about relationships, it's important that they understand it's an exchange of reinforcers, but it's an exchange of the reinforcers they and the other person wants. You hear it in books like The Languages of Love, where the man does chores and assumes that helps the woman know that he loves her, and the woman wants to be told, and there's these different levels of communication about what it means to reciprocate in a relationship, but ultimately the relationships that last are the ones in which both people are getting something they want. So you need to teach that. You need to teach reciprocity from the beginning. So how do we do it then? Well, one, recognize that exposure is not enough. You need to help them practice explicitly exchanging reinforcers. You need to help them practice the explicit social skills of initiating and maintaining conversations. You can't just put a person with autism in a group and expect them to come out of it with relationships. There's some wonderful data out of Autism Partnership showing that putting children with autism in a class full of typically developing peers for an entire summer school session led to no increase whatsoever in relationship development, and that relationships only formed when and only when the children were taught specific social skills to establish them. So we know that exposure is not enough. We also need to recognize that people want to build relationships with people they like. I think I see this a lot with high school teachers, and sometimes with parents. Will say, all right, Jenny and Tom have agreed to be your friend. They're going to eat lunch with you every day. I found a student to take you out. Hey, there's a student who wants to be a mentor. They'll be your friend. Now, I want you to think back to your 16-year-old self. If a teacher had come to you and said, this is Johnny. Johnny's going to be your friend because I said so. How well would that have gone down? They're teenagers first. Also remember that they're going to be a lot more willing to practice and use these social skills and relationship skills when the learning environment is fun and preferred for them. I once worked with a young man who was impeccable in my social skills class. Learned the skills, mastered them, was not generalizing. And when I asked him why, he said, essentially, well, I don't like these people and I don't want them to be my friend. Okay, fair enough. We shouldn't demand generalized performance of skills with people that they don't actually want relationships with. And that gets to this idea of relevance. If we're talking about sexual health, if we're talking about how to engage in healthy, masturbatory, or reciprocal sexual behavior, they need to see the relevance. It needs to matter to them. If they are homosexual and you're trying to provide education in the context of heterosexual relationships, they may not see the relevance. If you're trying to preach abstinence when they're wanting to be anything but, they're unlikely to see the relevance, and you're not going to see the same skill acquisition. So you've got to keep those things in mind, especially with sexuality. So why is it important? Why is this something we have to do? Well, I've already talked about some of it generally. I want to talk more specifically now. First, as in everything else about being an adult and having that agency that I talked about earlier, people on the spectrum have just as much a right to a full life experience that includes intimacy as any of the rest of us. They have the right to explore their identity as a person, as a sexual being. They have a right to experience what it means to be in close physical contact with another person if they so choose. And if they have that right, then we have an obligation to help them do that in a safe and healthy way as possible. Besides, even if we pretend that that's not the case, they're human. They will have urges. They will be interested, and they will try to learn anyway. Google is a powerful but scary thing when it comes to sexuality. We also know that if we don't take it by the horns and address it up front, that a lack of knowledge, even in people without disabilities, across the board, a lack of knowledge about healthy sexuality puts people at increased risk of abuse, exploitation, and potential criminal behavior. It also increases the likelihood of STDs and of teen pregnancy, but especially with our population, not giving them the knowledge and the tools that they need to be healthy, informed sexual beings puts them at dramatically increased risk of being taken advantage of. We also know that if we don't teach them about masturbation and boundaries in public and private, that engaging in behaviors like that in public, especially as they get older, is not just crippling socially, but potentially legally. So it's important. And how do we do it? Well, we've got to be proactive. We've got to get ahead of it. We know, as I've said earlier, that they are much more likely to stalk, to pursue someone who's uninterested longer, to ignore a partner's interests or needs, to stare, to inappropriately touch, to masturbate in public. You know, I put all those out there already. I guess this is a little bit redundant, but I do it to make the point. Think about the people with autism you know and how literal they are and how rule-governed they are. And I'll tell you a funny story that's kind of not, that's an example of this. One of our young men came to college, and his biggest stated goal in college was to get a girlfriend. He just wanted a girlfriend. And he got in one of those dating sites, and he read that dating is a numbers game. If you want a girlfriend, you got to ask out a lot of girls. If you want to go on dates, you're going to have to ask out 10 girls for every one that might say yes. And you're going to go on 10 first dates before you're likely to get a second date. He's a smart guy, and he walks into his introductory, I think it was a biology course, 200-300 people in the room. And he walks up to the very first girl in the very first room, and he goes, "Will you go to lunch with me?" She kind of looks at him, "No." Goes to the very next girl sitting next to her. "Will you go to lunch with me?" "No." Goes to the next girl. "Will you go to lunch with me?" And he just goes right down the line. The 8th or 9th girl finally says yes. Of course, stood him up. She had no intention of showing up. He did not perceive that as a problem. He thought he was being a wonderful problem solver. Hey, if I've got to ask out 10 girls to get a date, and I want a date, if I go to a class that's got 100 girls in it, I can have 10 dates in one day. It's efficient. He didn't perceive how that was seen by the women in that class. And were it not for a professor who reached out to us, that could have gotten the police involved. We've had other individuals with autism who are interested in a girl who know you're supposed to figure out what she likes, will get on Facebook and Facebook stalk. They look up everything about her, and then they start sharing all the things they learned about her because they think sharing all those things to her shows interest, and then it freaks her out. She runs away, she calls the cops, whatever. So it's not just as victims, but also as potential perpetrators that we have to recognize there's a need to be proactive. But here's the good news. I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes or so before I wrap up telling you why there's more out here than you think there is. I was telling Emily right before this started, I think sexuality and sexual health might be one of the few places in autism where there are a lot more resources out there than we ever knew, and we've just been afraid to ask. There are a lot of good curriculums. And there are complete and entire curriculums, free, that are available, like this one, Talk About Sex, that includes all of the elements that I will recommend for bodily functions, for pictures, it's visual, it talks about sexual health. There are literally dozens of curriculums for every functioning level, age, disability category. And I've given you lists to a couple of those resource lists at the end of this talk. The medical profession knows a lot about how to do this. And there's a lot of really wonderful information out there about puberty and sexual hygiene, sexual relationships, and how to talk to people about those things. The curriculum I held up even includes scripts for parents and teachers to use. Guided lessons, full lesson plans. There are really wonderful resources, but you have to be okay with it. You have to get comfortable with the words that up till now make us blush. When I do this talk publicly, I make the entire room repeat after me words like penis, vagina, masturbation, and everybody's horrified because I'm out in West Texas and scandalous. But our folks with autism need concrete, real examples, so you've got to get comfortable. How do you do it then? You've got a curriculum, you've decided you'll be okay and blushing is all right. Some other things to keep in mind. Sexuality is an intensely personal thing. It is vital that you listen and not judge. They may have a different orientation. They may have questions that fly in the face of your personally held religious or political beliefs, but what they most need when you're talking about sexuality and puberty is somebody to listen and someone to provide concrete, factual, scientific information. You've got to know that you've got to answer the questions. They're going to ask some that are going to make you just, that's okay. But remember, in this age of Google and Facebook and Twitter, that if you don't answer their questions, they're going to go ask somebody else. And that somebody else may be a classmate or an online predator. Unfortunately, for those of you who are uncomfortable, which is most of us, you have to be explicit. Visual is even better. And I'm not going to show you all the pictures because it's public webcam and I don't want to get fired on a university computer. But know that the curriculums I've included provide some very explicit pictures, and that's important. Just like a lot of our strategies for autism, visual matters. Know that you can monitor a lot more than you think you can, and take advantage of those controls. If you're a parent or a teacher and you're looking at one of these curriculums online, understand there are really good tools for you. Cable companies are wonderful at parental controls and monitoring, and take care of those, or take advantage of those. And as I said earlier, this won't be perfect. You're not going to get it right every time. The most important thing is to create an environment in which the person feels comfortable raising their questions, in which the person knows that if they ask, they're going to get an answer and not a lecture and not a sermon. So if you want to set the occasion to do this kind of education appropriately, you've got to be prepared to let it be a neutral, informative experience. So there's a really great article by Urbano and colleagues from a few years ago that identifies the best practices in sexuality education. And I'm just going to put these up here very quickly as a reference, with acknowledgement that the references and resources that you have take advantage of these. But know that every level, even from totally nonverbal, severely impacted people with developmental disabilities, will have sexual urges and must learn how to deal with them. I've taught grown men how to masturbate. It's part of the game. But you've also got to involve the parents. Parents and their values matter. You've got to teach in a highly structured way with concrete examples. I've already said that. We've already talked about how important it is, so you've got to make it happen. And then you've got to tie it to the individual. The thing is, if you think about this list, isn't that the exact same list of what the best instructional practices are for early intensive behavioral intervention? Aren't those the same list of best instructional practices from school-based consultations and curriculum programming there or positive behavior supports? Yeah, they are. Remember when I said earlier that good teaching is good teaching? Best instructional practice is best instructional practice. The things that work to teach other life skills work for these skills. All right, finally, this is from the Gerhardt slideshow that I've provided, so I'm not going to cover these individually. But know that these skills can be taught early. You don't have to wait till they're 14 or 15. You can start teaching about public versus private behavior with a child as young as 4 or 5. You can talk good touch, bad touch when they're children. You can teach improper and proper names of body parts. If you're talking to a 15-year-old about what to call a penis and you're preparing him to be in a locker room during football season, you're not just going to stop with the word penis. He needs to know those other words and how to use them. And we may all wish that were a dad conversation or an uncle conversation, but somebody needs to help the kid know how to use the right and the improper words for things if they're going to function socially among their skills or among their peers. Okay, that's my formal program. I want to thank you for listening and open it up to questions now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dotson. So I have a couple questions. I encourage you all to keep typing some of those in. I wanted to start with a question for the parents on the line. So I know we have quite a few parents on, and you discussed some evidence-based strategies and methods for teaching social skills that I think practitioners would be familiar with, like social stories and video modeling and things like that. But for parents who don't necessarily have any training in how to teach social skills, do you have any places you can point them or resources where they can learn?
I think there are two books that I really like, and I'm hoping they're close by, but I think I've lent them to my clinical team. Two books that I really enjoy about social skills. One is from the Boys Town program about developing social skills in adolescents and young adults. It's not specific just to autism, but it's Dowd and Sturmey, and it's social skills for adolescents. It's a really wonderful book that talks about a family-style approach to teaching social skills in a very concrete way. It gives scripts, it gives skill breakdowns, and it talks about how to do it both as a teaching interaction and also within day-to-day kind of interactions. I think it's one of the most accessible social skills books I'm familiar with. It doesn't use a lot of technical language, and it's really comfortable for families. There's also a book by Autism Partnership and that crew called Crafting Connections that I find to be a really intuitive and easy to read book about social skills in the context of relationships and not just individual standalone skills.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. I'll get those actual resources from you, and maybe we can add those to the slideshow too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Before we send the slides out. Okay. So then, now kind of turning more to our practitioners on the line. So, you know, you alluded many, many times to how talking about these topics can be really uncomfortable and how it's important to kind of set aside your own beliefs and biases when talking about these things with students. So if you are a practitioner who is working with one of these students, how do you advise kind of navigating that relationship with the parent to make sure they're comfortable with what you're teaching? And what if there are some you know, I guess disagreements or differences in what you think is important for the child to learn?
I think that's a question I could teach an entire graduate seminar on. No, I think transparency is key. I think that especially if you're in a school environment, you've got to be willing to be upfront about exactly what you're going to be teaching, and the parents need to have the opportunity to have a voice about whether or not their child participates. I could pretend that I wish I could mandate every child hear scientifically correct information at all times. I'm in West Texas. That's not always possible. Some communities have religious beliefs or just community beliefs that make it very unlikely that I'm going to be allowed to talk about some of these things in a public school classroom. What I will try to do often with folks on the spectrum, especially as puberty hits and maybe they're starting to masturbate in public, is I'll take advantage of the IEP process and try to get it as a part of that individualized plan so that right off the bat, if it goes into the IEP, the parents, the school administrators, the teachers, and the support staff like counselors and speech paths are involved in putting that goal in place so that I can evaluate buy-in from the beginning. And then often it's a matter of just working collaboratively and making sure, again, there shouldn't be surprises. And I think if you deal in correct factual information from the medical literature, that's all you can do.
Okay, thank you. That's good advice, especially going to the IEP. Okay, so I guess I'm sure this is a question that a lot of practitioners have, and I have one person who asked it in a pretty specific context. But I guess I'm wondering, you know, a lot of what you've been talking about is kind of teaching students the skills they need to engage in appropriate behaviors and navigate social relationships. But obviously, you know, you mentioned this at the beginning too, students are going to make mistakes and they're going to engage in inappropriate social behaviors. And when those are happening, in a classroom in front of other students, and maybe even sometimes at the risk of other students or in ways that are going to potentially, embarrass them or put them at risk. What are some ideas or strategies you have for practitioners working in those situations?
I think the first is to keep in mind the point that I made, that sometimes it's the hormones and not the disabilities. Mm-hmm. So when I say that in this case, I mean there are 13 and 14-year-old boys who get erections in the middle of class, touch themselves every day, with and without disabilities. Masturbation happens in every bathroom, in every public school in America, sometime during the day. Maybe not every bathroom. I may be overstating it, but I promise the things that make us go happen with every kid. We have probably all done some things going through puberty publicly, spectacularly embarrassingly, in ways that are horrifying. The kids are often more forgiving of that initially than the staff and the teachers are. And that's where I often see the disability or the label play a role. If you're typically developing 13-year-old, gets an erection in class, gets embarrassed, throws his coat over himself, pats himself with his hands to try to make it go away, and then runs to the bathroom, teacher probably doesn't even say anything. Our student on the spectrum does that, and the teacher goes to the special ed teacher and goes, he is masturbating in class, make him stop. So first, it's a mindset thing. Second, it's don't react in a way to put a target or a neon sign over that kid's head. If you see something like that happening, redirect in the same way you'd redirect other problem behaviors and address it privately. Figure out if it's a big problem, is it a little problem, is it a discrimination problem? When I put the list up there, and I'll go back a slide, or back more slide, there we go. So that public versus private behavior, that distinction is one of the most powerful to teach. If you can teach them to understand public versus private behavior, whatever is happening in public that's a problem, you can redirect with, this is a private behavior. Do you need to go to the bathroom or find another place? As a way to have a dialogue. If you teach public-private, then you can redirect whatever new behavior occurs into a private place that it can then be dealt with. So it's, as in most problem behaviors, although I don't consider this to really be problem so much as puberty, don't make the reaction bigger than the behavior. You don't want to put a big arrow. You don't want to draw attention to it. That's what often makes things worse.
Yeah, and I suppose, when students are acting out to seek attention in some of these ways too, which of course can be the case, you always just want to be focused on what is the function that behavior is serving, and that's how you're going to be responding.
Right. It really is being aware of kind of developmental norms. Like I said, ask yourself, what would you do if it was a child without autism?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, we are at 4:30 now, so I think I want to wrap things up so everyone can get off on time and have a chance to take our little survey at the end. So I just want to thank Dr. Dotson for being on the call today and for all of the valuable resources he shared. And we will be following up on Monday with a recording of the webinar, as well as Dr. Dotson's slides that you can take a look at with all of those resources. Yeah, and just references to some of the research if you're interested in looking more deeply into that. So, Dr. Dotson, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being on the call. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.